What if the greatest economic empires of the last century were not built on innovation or diplomacy, but on a single resource capable of bending nations, collapsing currencies, and rewriting the balance of global power? This question unsettles people because it forces us to recognize that the modern world did not emerge from orderly progress. It emerged from a struggle for control over the most strategic commodity ever discovered. Oil did not merely fuel machines, it fueled decisions, alliances, secret deals, and a new hierarchy of power that determined who would rise and who would fall. When you look closely, the prosperity of entire nations appears tied not to their ideals, but to their access to the wells that shaped destiny. This is where the story of American magnates begins. They were not just businessmen. They were architects of a new geopolitical architecture, men who understood that whoever mastered the flow of oil would master the direction of the global economy. Their fortunes expanded as fast as the world's dependence on energy, creating a loop where economic cycles, political influence, and military power became inseparable. Behind every major conflict, every financial boom, every sudden crash, there is usually an overlooked pattern connected to strategic energy control. That is why studying this history matters. It reveals hidden signals that repeat themselves, indicators that warned of past collapses, and that now whisper about vulnerabilities forming in the present. As you hear this, notice how many pieces begin to align. Maybe you have felt that some global events never happened by accident. Maybe you have sensed that the world economy moves according to forces that most people never see. You are not wrong. What you will uncover here may challenge what you thought you knew about power, wealth, and long-term economic manipulation. Before we go deeper, tell me something. Have you ever suspected that certain crises seemed almost engineered? If this resonates with you, share your thoughts in the comments. Leave a like to help this investigation reach more people, and make sure you are subscribed to the channel so you do not miss the next layers of this story. As we move forward, the patterns behind this century of oil-shaped domination begin to reveal threads that connect past decisions to the tensions unfolding today, creating a path that guides us into the next part of this narrative. In the early years of the 20th century, when most nations still underestimated the true strategic value of energy, a small group of American visionaries recognized that oil was not simply a commercial product. It was leverage. It was influence. It was the key capable of transforming a regional entrepreneur into a global magnate. These early figures observed a world shifting from coal and muscle power to engines, transportation networks, and industrial systems that demanded constant fuel. They understood that whoever controlled this new bloodstream of the modern world would gain an advantage no empire in history had ever possessed. This insight was not obvious at the time. Many governments focused on expanding land or military forces, while these emerging magnates quietly pursued drilling rights, transport routes, and financial structures that would soon reshape global markets. Their rise coincided with a period of accelerating technological change. Automobiles began to replace horse-drawn carriages, factories adopted machines that operated day and night, and nations sought new ways to project influence beyond their borders. Oil became the hidden requirement behind every form of progress. As consumption increased, the fortunes of these magnates grew alongside a dependency that nations could no longer reverse. They built infrastructures that stretched across continents, pipelines, and refineries that governments relied on but could not fully control. This imbalance allowed them to operate in a space between the private and the political, influencing currency flows, credit systems, and international agreements without ever appearing as formal actors in diplomacy. Understanding their mindset is essential. They were not gambling on temporary demand. They believed they were witnessing the creation of a new world order in which energy would determine the winners of economic cycles. Their investments were bold, often risky, but guided by a conviction that the future would belong to those who anticipated the next shift before it became visible to others. As their power expanded, so did the structures that tied the fate of entire economies to the decisions made in boardrooms rather than parliaments. And as this influence deepened, the first clear signs emerged of how oil would soon redefine the hierarchy of global power, setting in motion dynamics that would continue to intensify in the decades ahead, shaping not only markets, but the very architecture of international relations. As oil demand accelerated, something profound happened in the global economy, a silent shift in what truly defined power. Until then, nations measured influence through territory, population, or military might. But oil introduced a new logic, one that rewarded those who could guarantee energy supply over those who merely commanded armies. The emerging American magnates understood this better than anyone. They realized that oil was becoming a foundational asset, similar to a new kind of currency whose value extended far beyond its market price. This is when the modern concept of economic dominance began to detach from traditional resources and anchor itself to energy flows. Whoever controlled these flows could control industries, transportation, trade networks, and ultimately the direction of global growth. This transformation created an unprecedented economic hierarchy. Countries heavily reliant on imported oil found themselves vulnerable to price shocks, production cuts, and supply manipulation. Meanwhile, the magnates who controlled drilling, refining, and distribution used market volatility to consolidate their advantage. They could influence the cost of war, the rise of new industries, and the stability of foreign economies simply by adjusting output or negotiating exclusive agreements. For the first time, private actors held leverage comparable to nation-states, shaping policies indirectly through strategic pressure rather than formal authority. The world economy began to revolve, not around abstract financial models, but around the decisions of a small group of individuals who recognized oil as the central pillar of the emerging global order. This new system produced ripple effects that reached every corner of society. Labor markets adapted to industries dependent on constant fuel supply. Banking institutions recalibrated their models to integrate energy risk into currency valuation. Even political campaigns began to reflect the influence of sectors tied to energy interests. While most people focused on technological progress and rising consumer conveniences, a deeper truth remained hidden. The rise of oil had quietly rewritten the foundation upon which economic power rested. And as this foundation solidified, it revealed the first patterns that would later define major crises and geopolitical conflicts, patterns that still echo through the movements of markets and alliances today, guiding the trajectory of nations, more subtly and more forcefully than most ever realized. As the influence of American oil magnates expanded, their strategies evolved from simple market competition to sophisticated mechanisms of geopolitical control. What began as a race for drilling rights soon transformed into a long game of alliances, negotiations, and calculated pressure that shaped international relations. These magnates understood that raw resources alone were not enough. True power required the ability to steer governments, influence trade agreements, and manipulate economic cycles from behind the scenes. By leveraging their dominance over supply chains, they positioned themselves as indispensable partners to nations seeking growth, turning energy dependence into political leverage. Every refinery built overseas, every pipeline crossing borders, every exclusive contract created an invisible thread tying foreign economies to American strategic interests. This web of influence operated through subtle but powerful channels. When a nation faced unrest or shortages, its leaders often turned not to allies or institutions, but to American energy conglomerates for stability. In return, these companies secured favorable terms, access to new territories, and influence that extended far beyond economic transactions. They became intermediaries between diplomacy and commerce, shaping outcomes in ways that governments alone could not. At times, their decisions carried more weight than official foreign policy, altering the balance of power in regions where control over energy could determine political survival. These strategies were not openly discussed or acknowledged, yet they guided the course of wars, alliances, and economic recoveries throughout the century. Such maneuvers created patterns that many historians now view as early examples of modern economic manipulation. Through controlled scarcity, coordinated price adjustments, and strategic partnerships, oil magnates learned to anticipate global shifts before they became visible. Their actions often preceded major geopolitical events, revealing a deeper interplay between market behavior and political transformation. By analyzing these moves, one can uncover clues that still help predict future instability. And as these strategies intensified, they laid the foundation for a global system where energy became not just a resource, but a form of influence, capable of reshaping borders and economies alike. Tell me in the comments, what part of these hidden strategies resonates most with you or reminds you of patterns you see unfolding today, so we can explore how these signals continue to shape the world in ways most people overlook. As oil transformed into the backbone of the modern world, a powerful chain reaction reshaped the global landscape. The rise of American magnates did not only enrich a handful of businessmen, it restructured economies, redirected political ambitions, and altered the fate of entire regions. Nations that once relied on agricultural or mineral wealth suddenly found themselves dependent on oil imports to sustain industrial growth. This dependence created new vulnerabilities. A single disruption in supply, a shift in pricing, or a political standoff could send shockwaves through financial systems, collapsing markets and destabilizing governments. The magnates understood this fragility. They recognized that controlling the source of stability meant controlling the outcomes of nations far beyond their borders. As economies adapted to this new reality, old power structures weakened. Traditional empires that had dominated through territory or trade routes struggled to keep pace with a world driven by energy demand. Meanwhile, Emerging nations with large oil reserves gained influence, but often lacked the infrastructure or capital to harness their full potential. This allowed American companies to step in as indispensable partners, offering technology, investment, and expertise in exchange for long-term concessions. These arrangements reshaped geopolitical alliances, creating new dependencies that would define international relations for decades. The balance of power no longer rested on armies or colonies, but on access to a strategic commodity whose supply could never fully match the world's appetite. Financial markets evolved in tandem with these shifts. Currency valuations, credit systems, and stock exchanges began to respond to energy signals more than traditional economic indicators. A refinery accident, a diplomatic conflict, or even a rumor of reduced output could trigger global volatility. Investors learned to read oil trends as if they were weather forecasts predicting economic storms. This interconnectedness blurred the line between economics and geopolitics. The fortunes of Wall Street, the stability of foreign governments, and the security strategies of global powers all became intertwined with the decisions made by a handful of magnates who operated at the center of the energy network. Through these developments, a pattern emerged. Whenever oil markets experienced turbulence, political landscapes shifted soon after. These cycles repeated so consistently that they became a hidden, script-guiding world events revealing that oil had become more than a commodity. It had become the silent architect of global transformation, shaping outcomes in ways that still influence the present moment as the deeper dynamics continue to unfold. The emergence of the United States as the central arbiter of global markets did not happen by accident. It was the result of a deliberate strategy woven through economic policy, corporate expansion, and geopolitical alignment. As American oil magnates extended their reach across oceans, they built more than pipelines and refineries. They built influence networks that allowed the United States to sit at the crossroads of global decision-making. By controlling essential supply routes and refining capacity, they positioned the country as the indispensable mediator in times of crisis. When conflicts disrupted production in one region, when financial systems trembled, or when alliances fractured, nations consistently found themselves turning toward American intermediaries who could stabilize the situation with a single shipment or a negotiated concession. This rise coincided with profound shifts in global power structures. Europe, recovering from wars and economic exhaustion, increasingly relied on energy imports to rebuild its industries. Asian nations entering rapid modernization required stable supplies to sustain growth. Even oil-rich countries faced the paradox of possessing abundant resources while lacking the technological and logistical systems necessary to fully capitalize on them. American companies filled this gap, offering sophisticated extraction methods, large-scale investments, and security guarantees that tied entire regions to Washington's strategic vision. As these partnerships deepened, the United States gained an unparalleled ability to influence currencies, dictate trade terms, and shape long-term economic planning around the world. Meanwhile, domestic policy reinforced this external dominance. The U.S. government recognized that energy was the backbone of national security, and it aligned its diplomatic objectives with the interests of the oil sector. This alignment allowed American magnates to operate with a level of protection and support that competitors in other countries could rarely match. Their ventures abroad were backed not only by financial muscle, but by political weight, creating a hybrid force where private ambition and national strategy moved in tandem. Over time, this synergy solidified the United States as the guardian of global energy flows, enabling it to steer markets during periods of instability and to guide economic expectations in ways that favored its long-term interests. By the mid-20th century, the system had become so entrenched that nations could scarcely imagine an alternative. The United States was no longer just a major producer. It had become the stabilizing mechanism that balanced the world economy. And as the influence of American magnates continued to expand, they shaped not only markets but the very architecture of global order, setting the stage for the conflicts, crises, and realignments that would follow as the century progressed in the deeper cycles of energy. Driven power continued to evolve. As the 20th century progressed, the true depth of oil's influence became increasingly evident in the hidden negotiations and backstage maneuvers that rarely appeared in public records. Behind major geopolitical shifts, there were often closed-door conversations between American magnates, government officials, and foreign leaders who understood that energy decisions could redirect the fate of entire regions. These interactions formed a parallel system of power, one operating outside the formal channels of diplomacy. Oil executives shaped policy through financial incentives, strategic partnerships, and agreements that tied national priorities to corporate objectives. Their reach extended into intelligence networks, military logistics, and economic forecasting, creating a structure in which private interests and national strategy became nearly inseparable. As competition intensified, so did the stakes. Nations seeking independence from Western influence attempted to nationalize their resources or diversify alliances, but many soon discovered the limitations of defying established energy networks. Supply disruptions triggered economic turmoil. Political leaders who resisted certain arrangements faced internal instability or external pressure that forced them back into alignment. At the same time, American magnates used market tools to maintain dominance, engineering price fluctuations that strengthened their position during crises. These fluctuations were not random. They were strategic signals that often preceded larger geopolitical movements. Understanding these signals became essential for governments trying to predict global shifts before they unfolded on the world stage. The public, however, saw only fragments of these interactions. They witnessed sudden market crashes, unexpected diplomatic tensions, or wars that seemed to erupt without warning. But beneath these events lay recurring patterns, shaped by control over energy supply and economic leverage. When a region gained too much independence, investment slowed. When a new competitor emerged, production increased to drive prices down and weaken challengers. These tactics did not simply influence short-term profits. They molded long-term geopolitical outcomes that continue to echo through current global dynamics. The more one studies these patterns, the clearer it becomes that today's tensions are not anomalies, but extensions of strategies refined over decades by those who understood the enduring value of influence hidden behind the curtain. Tell me in the comments which part of this intricate behind-the-scenes system caught your attention the most, so we can explore how these patterns still shape global decisions in ways most people never notice. Throughout the 20th century, periods of apparent stability were repeatedly interrupted by sudden shocks that exposed how tightly the global system was bound to oil. These crises did not arise from isolated accidents or unpredictable disruptions. They emerged from structural vulnerabilities created by dependence on a single resource. When production halted in one region, when political tensions escalated, or when markets reacted to even subtle signals of scarcity, entire economies felt the impact. Currency values shifted overnight, inflation surged, and governments scrambled to manage public anxiety. The most revealing aspect of these cycles was how consistently they followed recognizable patterns. Each crisis, though unique in its details, mirrored earlier disruptions in the way markets reacted and in how political actors repositioned themselves in the aftermath. For American magnates, these turbulent moments were not merely obstacles but opportunities. They studied the rhythm of market panics, anticipating downturns, and positioning themselves to absorb competitors weakened by volatility. Their companies expanded during periods when others contracted, securing strategic assets at reduced costs and strengthening their influence in regions where instability forced governments to make concessions. This strategy allowed them to turn crises into periods of consolidation, reinforcing the idea that oil was more than an economic sector. It was a mechanism through which long-term dominance could be maintained. At the same time, foreign nations, aware of their vulnerability, intensified their reliance on American expertise and infrastructure, deepening the web of dependencies that shaped global power relations. These cycles also reshaped public perception. Citizens across the world experienced crises as abrupt shocks, unaware of the broader dynamics that connected their daily struggles to decisions made in distant boardrooms. Rising fuel prices affected food costs, transportation systems, and employment. Economic uncertainty eroded trust in political institutions. Yet few understood that each episode followed a broader pattern of systemic fragility. Observers who studied these events closely began to recognize the same signals repeating across decades: shifts in production, changes in monetary policy tied to energy markets, and geopolitical maneuvering disguised as economic adjustments. When viewed together, these signs reveal a deeper continuity running beneath historical disruptions, suggesting that the shocks were not anomalies, but extensions of long-established dynamics. As these crises accumulated, they carved a path that would define the next stage of global transformation, showing that the world's stability was increasingly shaped by the delicate balance between energy supply, economic cycles, and geopolitical ambition, a balance that continued to tighten as the century advanced and the stakes grew higher. By the late 20th century, the interdependence between oil, currency strength, and military power had become impossible to ignore. While governments spoke publicly about diplomacy and economic cooperation, the real architecture of global influence rested on a deeper connection: control over the energy that powered industrial growth and the financial systems that sustained national stability. The United States, already anchored by its oil magnates and energy networks, leveraged this connection to reinforce the dominance of its currency. As global trade increasingly relied on the dollar, nations found themselves tethered to a monetary system that drew its resilience from America's strategic position in the energy market. Every transaction conducted in dollars reinforced this structure, allowing the U.S. to project influence without direct intervention. Military power further solidified this relationship. Strategic alliances, defense agreements, and overseas deployments often aligned with regions critical to global energy flows. Protecting access to oil-rich territories meant protecting the stability of the dollar and preserving economic leadership. This synergy created a cycle in which military presence secured energy interests reinforced currency strength, and currency strength funded the military machine. Few nations could replicate this balance, and those that attempted lacked the global infrastructure necessary to sustain it. The result was a system that perpetuated itself, allowing the United States to shape world events through the combined force of economic and strategic leverage. Behind this visible structure, a subtler mechanism unfolded. Financial markets responded instinctively to changes in oil supply, price dynamics, and political developments near major energy hubs. Investors recognized that shifts in the energy landscape often foreshadowed broader geopolitical changes, and they adjusted their strategies accordingly. These adjustments influenced interest rates, capital flows, and exchange rates, creating feedback loops that spread across borders. The magnates who had built their empires in the early 20th century could not have predicted the full extent of this transformation, yet their foundational decisions had established the conditions that allowed these dynamics to flourish. Oil, once merely a commodity, had become the backbone of a global system in which economics, politics, and military strategy were inseparable. This convergence revealed another critical pattern. Whenever energy tensions escalated, currency volatility soon followed, and geopolitical shifts emerged not long after. These recurring cycles demonstrated that the world was operating under a unified framework, one shaped by dependencies that few people fully understood. As this framework solidified, it prepared the ground for the next stage of global realignment, where the implications of these intertwined forces would become even more pronounced and reshape the trajectory of international power. As the century drew to a close, the legacy of oil shaped more than markets and alliances. It shaped the very architecture of the modern world. The influence of American magnates, once confined to extraction fields and refineries, had expanded into a framework that touched every dimension of global life. Energy decisions influenced technological innovation, financial cycles, international trade routes, and even cultural expectations about progress and prosperity. Nations built their futures on models that assumed the uninterrupted flow of oil, tying their stability to a system whose foundations had been laid decades earlier by individuals who understood the long-term power of strategic resources. The patterns repeated across generations, periods of abundance followed by volatility, rising competitors constrained by structural limitations, and geopolitical tensions emerging wherever the balance of supply and influence shifted. Yet beneath the visible structure lay something more subtle and enduring. The same forces that empowered the United States for decades continued to guide global expectations, shaping how investors interpreted risk, how governments approached diplomacy, and how societies understood their vulnerabilities. The world had been conditioned to respond to the signals of energy markets as though they were natural rhythms rather than engineered outcomes. Even today, currency movements, strategic alliances, and military posturing often reflect deeper currents linked to energy dependence. The system may evolve, but the blueprint remains remarkably consistent with the one forged by early magnates who recognized that controlling the economic bloodstream meant controlling the future. Understanding this legacy is essential for interpreting modern events. When crises erupt or alliances shift, the underlying logic often traces back to dynamics established long before current leaders took power. The past is not merely historical context, it is the operating system that continues to run beneath the surface of global decision-making. Recognizing these signals equips us to interpret the present with greater clarity and anticipate how emerging tensions might unfold. And as new forms of energy, technology, and geopolitical ambition emerge, the lessons of oil's century-long dominance offer a roadmap for understanding the next phase of global transformation, revealing patterns that still shape the direction of nations and the movement of economies. If you reach this point with me, share a comment saying this message was for me, so I know you stayed until the end. And if this journey through the hidden architecture of global power brought you new insights, consider subscribing to the channel and leaving a like to strengthen this space where we explore the signals that shape the world. And before you go, there's another video here that deepens this conversation from a new angle. So click and continue with me as we follow the next thread in this story.